Chapter 1. A Mystery in the Dark. Emily stood by the window, her forehead pressed against the cold glass. The street outside was empty, with only the faint glow of streetlights piercing through the thick fog. Her hand trembled as she held her phone, unable to make the one call that seemed so simple. Her breathing was uneven, and her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard outside. She had just discovered the truth, but this truth could destroy everything she had tried to save. A sudden knock on the door snapped her out of her daze. Emily flinched and turned around. No one. Another knock, louder and more insistent this time. A strange, sticky sense of dread began to rise inside her. She quickly scanned the room, her eyes landing on the old clock on the mantelpiece. Midnight. The knock came again, closer this time. The door was locked with a chain, but she knew that wouldn't stop whoever was on the other side. Her thoughts flashed back to what had happened just a few hours earlier when her already fragile world had completely shattered. She remembered the wedding, that grand, luxurious hall filled with guests whose faces she barely recognized. She saw Jonathan's smile, but it was empty, fake, like something cut out of a glossy magazine. And then there was that moment when she first felt like a stranger at her own wedding. Her husband had disappeared from view, and her mother-in-law, as always, stared at her coldly, as if she were a bothersome obstacle. But all of that now seemed insignificant compared to what she had learned that evening. To discover that this entire marriage was a premeditated deception, to learn that she had been used, to realize that her life could be in danger because she knew too much. The knocking stopped, but the tension remained. She cautiously approached the door and pressed her ear against the cold wood. Silence. Emily tightened her grip on the phone and finally made up her mind. She had to call Jason. Only he could help her. But as she dialed the number, the phone slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. At that very moment, the door swung open with a violent crash. The darkness of the room filled with a shadow not her own, and Emily knew there was no escape. Chapter 2. Family Secrets. Emily woke up to the blinding light streaming through the curtains. Still shaken by the terror of the previous night, she slowly got out of bed, trying to discern what was real and what was a nightmare. Her head throbbed and her body felt foreign. The fear that had gripped her all night returned the moment she realized what was happening. Jonathan was gone. Again. He had vanished before dawn without a trace, as if he had never been there. This had become typical of him. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, a home that looked perfect on the outside, but was rotting from within. Emily slowly approached the mirror and saw her reflection, a pale face, dull eyes filled with exhaustion and disappointment. She tried not to think about what she had overheard the night before, but the thoughts kept returning, replaying the conversation she had accidentally overheard at the wedding. When she returned to the reception, Jonathan was already drunk. He sat surrounded by his friends, laughing and acting as if his wife didn't exist. Emily felt out of place among these people and quietly slipped outside to be alone. Her solitude was interrupted when she heard familiar voices. Abigail, Jonathan's mother, was standing by the door, talking to her friend. Their voices were hushed, but Emily caught enough to make her heart race. "She'll never be one of us," Abigail's cold words echoed. "I warned Jonathan that this girl was just using him. She's a cunning deceiver, and I won't rest until she's gone." Emily froze. Fear gripped her, but along with it came a newfound resolve. She realized her marriage to Jonathan was part of some twisted game she had been dragged into against her will. They didn't see her as part of the family. She was just a tool in their plans. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of the phone. Emily jumped, her heart racing even faster. Jason's name flashed on the screen. She knew she had to answer, but at that moment, a strange feeling washed over her. What if everything she had learned was part of a larger conspiracy than she could imagine? She needed to be careful, or she could lose everything she held dear. Emily took a deep breath and answered the call. "Emily," Jason's voice was filled with urgency. "We need to talk. I've found something. You need to see this." She realized that what she had uncovered was just the beginning. Something far more sinister awaited her, and there was no turning back. Chapter 3. False Friends. Emily hurried through the deserted city streets, heading to the cafe where she had arranged to meet Jason. Her world had been turned, upside down by what she had learned, and her mind was racing with thoughts of danger and betrayal. Every passerby seemed to watch her suspiciously, and the shadows around every corner felt like they were closing in. When she entered the cafe, Jason was already there, sitting at a table in the back, isolated from the other patrons. He looked up as she approached, and she immediately knew from the look in his eyes the news wasn't good. She sat down across from him, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "You look terrible," he said quietly, sliding a cup of hot coffee toward her. "I'm not in the mood for compliments, Jason," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "What did you find?" Jason glanced around the cafe, making sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a few folded sheets of paper and placed them in front of her. Emily recognized them immediately. They were Jonathan's financial documents. But something about them seemed off, something she hadn't noticed before. "This is what I wanted to show you," Jason said as she began to skim through the pages. "Jonathan's been lying to you the whole time. Your marriage was just part of his scheme to cover up financial fraud. These documents prove that he's been using your name to launder large sums of money." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jason's words were like a nightmare come to life. How could she have been so blind? She thought back to all the moments Jonathan had been cold and distant. Now it all made sense. "And that's not all," Jason continued, his voice low. "His mother, Abigail, knew about it the whole time. In fact, she was the mastermind behind the whole scheme. I'm certain they're planning to get rid of you as soon as you're no longer useful." Emily froze. A sudden wave of terror washed over her. She was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The world around her seemed to be collapsing right before her eyes. But something about Jason's words made her hesitate. Her intuition told her that there was more to this story than he was letting on. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, looking directly into his eyes. "Why are you risking everything to tell me this?" Jason hesitated for a moment, then looked away. His fingers drummed nervously on the table. "Because you were the only one who believed in me when no one else did. I couldn't just stand by and watch them use you and throw you away. But there's something else. I suspect someone close to you is playing against you. You need to be careful, Emily. Trust no one." Emily shuddered. Everything she thought she knew suddenly felt like a lie. She realized that she was caught in the middle of a web of betrayal and deception. Now she had to figure out who among her circle was truly a friend and who was an enemy. And most importantly, what to do next to survive this deadly game. As she left the cafe, the cold wind whipped against her face, but it no longer mattered. Emily knew one thing: she had to fight. Chapter 4. Flight or Fight. Emily returned home, her mind swirling with doubt and fear. Jason's words echoed in her head. Trust no one. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching her, and yet, as much as she wanted to run, something held her back. She knew she had to act, and quickly. When she entered the house, a foreboding silence greeted her. Usually, Abigail would be there, always hovering, always controlling, but today the house was empty. Emily slowly climbed the stairs to the bedroom, her thoughts racing. She knew she needed to pack her things and leave, but something stopped her. When she entered the bedroom, she found a small envelope lying on the bed. It hadn't been there before. A sense of dread washed over her, but she couldn't resist opening it. Inside was a note with a short message. "We know what you discovered." Attached to it was a photograph of her and Jonathan on their wedding day, the picture neatly cut in half, separating her from him. Emily felt her heart race even faster. Someone was playing with her, and she realized time was running out. She grabbed her phone and tried to call Jason again, but this time there was no answer. Panic began to rise inside her, but just as she was about to leave the house, she heard a creak, and the bedroom door began to slowly open. Emily froze. Jonathan stepped into the room, his face dark and tense. He closed the door behind him, and the atmosphere grew heavy with dread. Emily took a step back, but Jonathan didn't move. His eyes glinted with a strange light, and she suddenly knew that he was aware. He knew about her meeting with Jason, about everything she had uncovered. He wasn't going to let her go. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into," he growled, his voice dripping with menace. "You never should have dug into this. Now there's no way out for you." Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. But before she could respond, Abigail walked into the room. Her face was a mask of disdain and triumph. "I warned you," she said with a bitter smile. "You were just a pawn in our game, and now that you're no longer needed, we'll be getting rid of you. No one will even notice you're gone." Emily felt the ground give way beneath her. Her plan was shattered. She was trapped. But then something happened that no one expected. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass filled the room, and the bedroom door burst open with such force that everyone turned to look. Standing in the doorway, bloodied and bruised, was Jason, holding a gun. "No one's touching her," he rasped, aiming the weapon at Jonathan and Abigail. "This ends now." Emily couldn't believe her eyes. But before she could react, events unfolded even more rapidly. Abigail, without hesitation, lunged at Jason, and the room exploded with the deafening sound of a gunshot. She fell to the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. Jonathan froze, then slowly began to retreat, but it was too late. Jason turned the gun on him, and Jonathan collapsed to his knees, begging for mercy. "You have no idea what you've done," Jason hissed. But then, unexpectedly, he lowered the gun. "But I'm not a killer. Let the law decide your fate." Emily, trembling, stepped toward Jason, her expression a mix of shock and gratitude. She couldn't believe what had just happened. But Jason suddenly grabbed her arm and whispered, "Emily, we need to go. Right now. This isn't over." They ran out of the house, leaving chaos and destruction behind. All Emily could think was that she was now in the center of a deadly game where no one could be trusted, not even those who claimed to be her saviors. But as they sped away from the house, Emily realized one thing. She had to stop being a victim and start fighting for her life. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Ally. Emily and Jason sped through the night, leaving behind the house where her life had almost come to an abrupt end. The fear that had gripped her so tightly was still there, but alongside it now burned a fierce determination. She could no longer afford to be passive. As the car swerved onto a gravel road, Emily knew that whatever lay ahead, she had to be ready. When they reached their destination, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, Jason pulled the car to a stop. The place looked abandoned, as if it hadn't seen guests in years. Emily stepped out of the car, her mind still reeling from the events of the night. She couldn't shake the thought that Jonathan was dead, and yet Jason was still by her side, despite everything that had happened. "Are we safe here?" Emily finally asked, eyeing the motel with suspicion. Jason nodded slowly, though his face remained tense. "For now, yes, but we need to talk. There are things you need to understand before we can make our next move." They entered the motel and found a room on the second floor. As soon as they closed the door behind them, Jason began to speak. "Emily, the truth is, I'm not just an agent, and not everything I told you earlier was a lie. I did want to protect you, but the situation is much more complicated than I anticipated." Emily listened intently, her mind racing. She knew that everything now depended on whether she could trust Jason or not. "Jonathan and his mother were part of a larger criminal network," Jason continued. "But what they were doing was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind them stands a far more powerful organization that seeks complete control over people like you. Those who can be useful to their plans, then discarded when they're no longer needed. Your marriage to Jonathan was just a tool for them." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "But why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why was I the target?" Jason looked at her with sadness in his eyes. "Because you're connected to someone who once betrayed this organization, your father. He left them and went into hiding, but they knew he would contact you one day. He passed on information to you, without your knowledge, that could destroy their entire operation. You've been a target ever since." Emily felt her world collapsing once again. She had never known her father. He had disappeared from her life when she was just a child. The idea that he was involved with something so dangerous seemed impossible. But now, everything was starting to make sense. Her life had been turned upside down by events she never even knew were happening. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice full of desperation. "I want you to trust me," Jason replied. "We can take down this organization if we find the information your father left with you. It's somewhere inside you, and they're searching for it too." At that moment, a loud knock echoed through the room. Emily and Jason exchanged anxious looks. Could they have been found already? Jason grabbed his gun and cautiously approached the door. He opened it with a swift motion, ready for the worst. But standing on the other side was someone Emily hadn't seen in years, a woman she thought she would never see again. It was her mother, Rebecca, who had disappeared from her life when she was only 10 years old. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Mom?" she gasped, taking a step back. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca stepped into the room, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm here to save you, Emily. I know who you really are and what they want from you. But if you want to survive, you'll have to trust me, not Jason. We don't have much time, and you need to make a choice." Emily froze, unable to process what was happening. Her mother, who she had long thought lost, suddenly appeared at the most critical moment. Now she was faced with a choice. Trust Jason, who had saved her more than once but had hidden his true nature, or follow her mother, whom she hadn't seen in over a decade and didn't know whose side she was truly on. A heavy silence hung in the air. In that moment, Emily realized her life would never be the same. No matter what decision she made, there would be no turning back. Chapter 6. Masks Unveiled. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend the situation. Her mother, Rebecca, who had been absent for most of her life, had just reappeared, claiming to have come to save her. And then there was Jason, the man who had protected her but also deceived her. The choice before her felt impossible. Rebecca took a step closer, her eyes pleading with Emily. "Emily, you have to trust me," Rebecca urged. "Jason may have helped you, but he's not who he says he is. He's been working for the organization from the start. His job was to keep you close, to ensure you never realized the truth about who you are and what you hold." Jason's face remained calm, but his eyes narrowed. "Don't listen to her, Emily," he said firmly. "Yes, I was working for them at first, but I turned against them the moment I realized what they were planning. Your mother disappeared because she's part of that organization. She's been lying to you your whole life." Emily's head spun with confusion. Both of them were accusing each other of betrayal, and she had no way of knowing who was telling the truth. "Why should I trust either of you?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "You've both lied to me. How do I know you're not both using me for your own reasons?" Rebecca's expression softened, and she reached out to touch Emily's arm. "Because I'm your mother," she said softly. "I left to protect you. The organization wanted to use you, just like they used me and your father. But I escaped, and I've been trying to find a way to save you ever since." Jason, still holding his gun, looked at Rebecca with disdain. "Don't fall for her lies, Emily. She's here because they finally tracked you down, and they're desperate to get the information your father left you. Information that could bring down the entire organization. She's here to take you back to them." Emily's heart raced as she weighed her options. Both Rebecca and Jason had their own motives, and both had reasons to deceive her. But something in Rebecca's eyes made Emily hesitate. She had longed for her mother's return for years, and now that she was here, the idea that she could be lying felt unbearable. But before Emily could make a decision, the room was flooded with light as the door was kicked open. Armed men burst in, weapons drawn, and surrounded them. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them. members of the organization, the same people who had been hunting her. The leader of the group, a tall man with a cold, calculating gaze, stepped forward. "Well, well," he said with a smirk. "It looks like we have a little family reunion. How touching." Jason and Rebecca both raised their hands in surrender, and Emily felt her blood run cold. The man's eyes locked onto her, and he smiled cruelly. "Emily, you've caused us a lot of trouble," he said. "But it's over now. You're coming with us. It's time to unlock the secrets your father left inside you." Emily felt a wave of panic wash over her. She was trapped. Both Jason and Rebecca had been right. She was the key to something much bigger than she had ever imagined. But now, with the organization's agents surrounding her, escape seemed impossible. As the leader reached out to grab her, Emily did the only thing she could think of. She lunged toward Jason, grabbing the gun from his hand and pointing it at the leader. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "I won't let you take me." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The leader paused, eyeing the gun in Emily's shaking hands. For a moment, it seemed as though he might comply, but then he laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You won't shoot, Emily," he said calmly. "You don't have it in you." But just as Emily's resolve began to falter, Rebecca sprang into action. She tackled the leader to the ground, knocking the wind out of him and giving Jason the opportunity to grab another weapon from one of the fallen agents. "Run, Emily!" Rebecca shouted, holding the leader down with all her strength. "Go now!" Emily hesitated for a split second, but then turned and sprinted for the door, Jason right behind her. They burst out of the motel and into the night, the cold air hitting Emily's face like a slap. She didn't stop running until they reached the car, where Jason shoved her inside and jumped into the driver's seat. As they sped away from the motel, Emily looked back and saw Rebecca standing in the doorway, watching them go. Her mother's face was shadowed, but for a brief moment their eyes met. Emily couldn't tell if Rebecca was saying goodbye or if she had something else in mind. But one thing was certain: the game was far from over. When they were a safe distance away, Jason finally spoke. "I'm sorry for everything, Emily," he said quietly. "But I promise you, we're going to end this. Together." Emily didn't respond. She stared out the window, her mind racing. The truth had been revealed, but it had only brought more questions. Who could she really trust? And how far would she have to go to uncover the answers? As the car sped into the darkness, Emily knew that there was no turning back. The masks had been unveiled, but the real battle was only beginning. Chapter 7. The Plot Twist. The car sped through the night as Emily tried to process everything that had happened. The revelation that both Jason and Rebecca had been hiding the truth from her left her feeling more lost and betrayed than ever. But there was no time to dwell on it. Danger was closing in from all sides, and she knew she had to stay focused. As they drove, Jason kept glancing at Emily, his face tense with concern. He could sense her inner turmoil, but he didn't know how to break through the wall of distrust that had formed between them. "We're almost there," Jason said finally, breaking the silence. "I have a safe house set up where we can regroup and figure out our next move." Emily nodded, though she felt anything but safe. She couldn't shake the image of her mother, Rebecca, watching them leave the motel. Was she really on Emily's side, or was this all part of some larger plan? Every fiber of Emily's being screamed that she couldn't trust anyone. Not Jason, not Rebecca, not even herself. The car pulled up to an isolated cabin deep in the woods. It was a small, unassuming structure, hidden away from prying eyes. As they stepped inside, Emily was struck by the silence. It was almost too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jason closed the door behind them and began securing the cabin, checking the windows and locking the doors. Meanwhile, Emily sat down at the worn wooden table, her mind racing. She knew there were still pieces of the puzzle she didn't have, but she was determined to find them. After securing the cabin, Jason turned to Emily, his expression serious. "Emily, I know you have every reason to doubt me," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I need you to understand something. This organization, we're dealing with something far bigger than either of us. If they get their hands on the information your father left you, they'll use it to control everything. We can't let that happen." Emily looked up at Jason, searching his face for any hint of deception. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of everything she had learned made it difficult. Before she could respond, there was a sudden knock on the door. Emily's heart leaped into her throat as Jason reached for his gun, signaling for her to stay quiet. He moved cautiously toward the door, peering through the small window. "It's her," he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Emily's pulse quickened. "Her? Who?" Jason hesitated before answering. "Rebecca. She must have followed us here." Before Emily could react, Jason opened the door, and Rebecca stepped inside. Her clothes were dirty, and there was a cut above her eye, but she seemed otherwise unharmed. "Mom?" Emily's voice was a mixture of shock and confusion. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca looked from Emily to Jason, her expression unreadable. "I came because I need you to hear the truth, Emily. The real truth." Emily's mind raced. More truths, more secrets. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. Jason stepped forward, his gun still in hand. "What game are you playing, Rebecca? You expect us to believe you just want to talk." Rebecca raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I know you don't trust me, and I don't blame you, but you need to know what's really going on before it's too late." Emily stared at her mother, torn between disbelief and hope. "Then tell me, what haven't you told me?" Rebecca took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Your father wasn't just running from the organization. He was one of its leaders. He was the one who developed the technology that could control people's minds, the technology that's hidden inside you." Emily felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her father, one of the leaders? The very thing she had been running from her whole life had been created by her own blood. "But why?" Emily whispered, struggling to comprehend. "Why would he do that?" "He didn't want to," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "He realized too late what he had created, what it could do. That's why he tried to destroy it, why he hid the key inside you. He thought it was the only way to protect you and keep the technology out of the wrong hands." Jason's grip on his gun tightened, his face hardening as he processed the information. "So all of this, everything we've been through, was to protect something your father created?" Rebecca nodded. "And now the organization is desperate to retrieve it. They know that if they can't control it, they must destroy it. And that means destroying you, Emily." The room fell into a tense silence as the full weight of Rebecca's words sank in. Emily felt numb, her mind reeling from the shocking revelation. But then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, Jason's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening in alarm. "We need to go. Now," he said urgently. "What's happening?" Emily asked, panic rising in her chest. "They're coming," Jason replied, his voice grim. "The organization knows where we are. They're sending everything they've got to take you." Emily's blood ran cold. There was no time to think, no time to process. They had to move, and fast. As they rushed out of the cabin and into the dark woods, Emily knew that everything had changed. The stakes were higher than ever, and the people she thought she could trust were now her greatest uncertainty. But one thing was clear. Whatever lay ahead, she would have to face it head-on. There was no more running, no more hiding. The final showdown was coming, and Emily was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 8. The Final Game. The forest was eerily silent as Emily, Jason, and Rebecca moved quickly through the darkness, the shadows of the trees closing in around them. The sense of urgency hung heavy in the air. There was no escaping the fact that the organization was closing in on them. Emily's mind raced, replaying everything she had just learned. Her father had created the technology that the organization sought, and now she was the key to it all. As they ran, Emily struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the distant hum of helicopters and the faint sound of voices, signs that the organization's forces were drawing near. There was no time left to question, to doubt. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Jason led the way, his face set with determination, while Rebecca followed close behind. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process the reality of her situation. Every step she took brought her closer to a confrontation she wasn't sure she was ready for. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing in the woods. Jason stopped abruptly, turning to face Emily and Rebecca. His expression was tense, his eyes filled with a mix of resolve and fear. "This is it," Jason said, his voice low but firm. "We can't run any further. We need to make a stand here." Rebecca nodded in agreement, though there was a hint of desperation in her eyes. "Emily, you have to be ready. They're coming for you and they won't stop until they get what they want. But you have more power than you realize. Your father made sure of that." Emily looked between Jason and her mother, fear gnawing at her insides. "What do you mean? What power?" "Your father didn't just hide the technology inside you," Rebecca explained. "He gave you the ability to control it. You're the only one who can unlock its full potential, or destroy it forever." Emily's mind spun with the weight of this revelation. She had spent so long running, hiding, trying to survive, that the idea of having power over this nightmare felt alien. But there was no time to dwell on it. The sound of footsteps and rustling leaves grew louder as the organization's agents closed in on their position. Jason checked his weapon, his gaze shifting between the darkened trees. "Emily, listen to me. Whatever happens, you have to trust yourself. If it comes down to it, use whatever your father gave you. Don't let them take you." Emily swallowed hard, nodding. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The time for doubt was over. Suddenly, the clearing was flooded with light as a dozen armed men emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the small group. At their head was the leader of the organization, the same man who had confronted them before. His cold, calculating gaze locked onto Emily, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The prodigal daughter returns. You've led us on quite the chase, Emily, but it ends here. Hand over the information, and we might just let you live." Emily's heart pounded as she stared back at him, every muscle in her body tense. She knew he was lying. There would be no mercy, but she wasn't the same frightened girl she had been before. She had faced too much, lost too much. Now, it was time to fight back. Jason stepped forward, his gun raised, but the leader waved his hand dismissively, and one of the agents shot Jason in the leg, sending him crumpling to the ground with a cry of pain. "Stay down, hero," the leader sneered. "This is between Emily and us." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she watched Jason writhe in pain, but she held her ground. She could feel something stirring inside her, something that had been buried deep, waiting for this moment. The fear, the anger, the desperation, they all coalesced into a single, burning resolve. "You think you can control me?" Emily said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You think you can use me like you used my father?" The leader's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, girl. You're out of your depth." Emily shook her head. "No, you're the one who doesn't understand." In that moment, Something inside Emily snapped into place. She felt a surge of energy, a connection to the technology her father had hidden within her. It was as if a door had opened, revealing the full extent of her power. The agents around her hesitated, sensing the change in the air. But it was too late. With a single thought, Emily unleashed the power she had inherited. The air crackled with energy as the technology activated, disrupting the weapons and equipment of the agents around her. The lights flickered and died, leaving the clearing in darkness, except for the glow that now emanated from Emily herself. The leader staggered back, his confidence shattered. What are you?" Emily stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "I'm the end of your game." Before the leader could react, Emily focused her energy, and with a final surge, she sent out a shockwave that knocked him and his agents to the ground. Their weapons shorted out, their communications jammed. In an instant, the organization's power over her was broken. As the dust settled, Emily stood alone in the clearing, her breathing heavy. The agents lay unconscious around her, and the leader struggled to rise, his expression one of disbelief. "You could have had everything," he gasped, his voice weak. "You could have ruled." Emily shook her head. "I don't want power. I want freedom. For myself. For everyone." With that, she turned away from the broken man, walking over to where Jason lay injured. Rebecca rushed to help him as Emily knelt beside them, her heart heavy but resolute. "It's over," Emily said quietly, though she knew the fight had only just begun. "We have to finish this once and for all." Jason nodded, wincing in pain. "We will. Together." As the three of them prepared to leave the clearing, Emily knew that the battle was far from over. But now, for the first time, she felt in control of her destiny. The final game had begun, and she was ready to play it on her own terms. Chapter 9. False Calm. The sun was beginning to rise as Emily, Jason, and Rebecca made their way back through the forest, the first rays of light filtering through the trees. The air was heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation, but for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of hope. Emily had tapped into the power her father had hidden within her, and for the moment, they had managed to fend off the organization. But the victory felt fragile, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. They reached a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods, another safe house Jason had prepared. As they stepped inside, the exhaustion of the night's events hit them all at once. Jason, limping from his wound, collapsed onto a worn-out sofa, wincing as Rebecca bandaged his leg. Emily stood by the window, staring out at the forest, her mind racing. Despite everything, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The words of the organization's leader echoed in her mind. "You could have had everything. You could have ruled." He had spoken those words with such conviction, as if he truly believed that power was the only thing worth having. But that wasn't what Emily wanted. She wanted to be free of this nightmare, to live a life that wasn't defined by secrets and lies. As the morning light grew brighter, Emily turned to face Jason and Rebecca. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was clear that they needed to plan their next move. "We can't keep running," Emily said, breaking the silence. "They'll keep coming for us no matter where we go. We have to end this." Jason nodded, grimacing as he adjusted his bandages. "I agree. But we need to be smart about it. They'll regroup and come back stronger. We have to be ready." Rebecca, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "There's something you need to know, Emily. Something I haven't told you yet." Emily's heart skipped a beat. After everything they had been through, she wasn't sure she could handle another revelation, but she knew she had to hear it. "What is it?" she asked, bracing herself for the worst. Rebecca looked down at her hands, as if gathering the strength to speak. When she finally met Emily's gaze, her eyes were filled with regret. Your father. He left one final safeguard in place. A fail-safe, in case the organization ever got too close to finding you. It's a self-destruct mechanism, built into the technology he hid within you. If you trigger it, it will wipe out all traces of the data completely and permanently. But it will also destroy you. The room fell silent as the weight of Rebecca's words sank in. Emily felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. The idea that her own life was tied to the destruction of the technology was almost too much to bear. But deep down, she knew that her father had done it out of love, to protect her and the world from the horrors the organization would unleash if they ever gained control. So you're saying, Emily said slowly, that the only way to stop them for good is to sacrifice myself? Rebecca's voice trembled as she replied, It's not a choice I ever wanted you to face, but yes, if it comes down to it, triggering the fail-safe might be the only way to ensure they never get what they want. Jason, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally found his voice. There has to be another way. We've fought too hard to lose you now, Emily. We can find another solution. Emily shook her head, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. What if there isn't another way? What if this is the only way to end it once and for all? Jason's eyes were filled with anguish. Emily, you can't just give up. We're so close. We'll figure something out, I swear. Rebecca's expression was pained as she watched the two of them. I don't want to lose you, Emily. But if the time comes, you need to be prepared to make that decision. Emily looked between Jason and Rebecca, her heart aching with the gravity of the situation. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now she was faced with an impossible choice. Could she really sacrifice herself to protect the world from the darkness her father had created? Before she could respond, a sudden noise from outside shattered the tense silence. The sound of footsteps crunching on leaves growing closer by the second. Emily's pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for the gun Jason had given her earlier. They've found us, Jason said grimly, pushing himself up despite the pain in his leg. We need to move. Now. Emily's heart raced as the reality of the situation set in. There was no more time for planning, no more time for second guessing. They had to act. But as they prepared to make their escape, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps outside weren't hurried or frantic. They were slow, deliberate. And then, as if confirming her worst fears, a familiar voice called out from the other side of the door. Emily, it's me. Open the door. Her blood ran cold. It was the voice of the organization's leader, the man she had thought she had defeated in the clearing. But how had he survived? And why was he here now, alone? Jason and Rebecca exchanged worried glances, and Jason mouthed silently, It's a trap. Emily's hand tightened around the gun as she moved toward the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she had to face him. She needed answers. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. The leader stood there, his clothes disheveled, his face pale but defiant. He smiled coldly at her, but there was something different in his eyes, something desperate. Surprised to see me? He asked, his voice laced with bitterness. You thought you could just walk away from this, didn't you? Emily stepped back, keeping the gun trained on him. What do you want? The leader's smile faded, and for the first time, Emily saw fear in his eyes. I came to make a deal, Emily. We're both out of time. You can't win, and neither can I. But maybe, just maybe, we can both walk away from this alive. Emily's heart raced as she tried to make sense of his words. Could he really be telling the truth? Or was this just another trick, another trap meant to lure her into his grasp? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine desperation. Whatever he was planning, It was clear that he was running out of options. "You have one chance to explain," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Make it quick." The leader's eyes flickered with something that might have been relief. "Your father's failsafe. It's more than just a self-destruct mechanism. It's a key that can shut down the entire organization. Permanently, but it requires both of us to activate it." Emily's mind reeled. Was this another lie? Another ploy to manipulate her? Or was there some truth to his words? Before she could respond, the leader took a step closer, his voice urgent. "Think about it, Emily. This is our only chance. We can end this, together, or we can both die here, and the organization will win." Emily's grip on the gun tightened as she considered her options. She knew she couldn't trust him, but she also knew that if there was even a chance to destroy the organization, she had to take it. But in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing fear whispered that this was all wrong, that there was something she still didn't know, something vital that could change everything. And as she stood there, staring into the eyes of her enemy, Emily realized that the final game was about to begin, and this time there would be no second chances. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. The tension in the air was palpable as Emily stood in the doorway, the cold wind from the forest biting at her skin. She kept the gun steady, her eyes locked on the leader of the organization who stood before her. His desperation now laid bare. Everything had led to this moment, and the weight of it threatened to crush her. Jason and Rebecca remained silent behind her, both watching, waiting. They knew the stakes, and they knew that whatever decision Emily made next could change everything. The leader's offer hung in the air, a chance to end it all. But at what cost? "You want me to trust you," Emily said slowly, her voice laced with skepticism. "You think I'll believe that you want to shut down the organization after everything you've done?" The leader's eyes were cold, but there was a hint of vulnerability in them now, something Emily hadn't seen before. "I don't care if you trust me," he replied. "I care about survival. The organization has become a beast that none of us can control anymore. If we don't stop it, it will consume us all. You have the power to end this, Emily, but I can't do it without you." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She knew there was more to this, something he wasn't telling her, but she also knew that she was running out of time. If there was even a chance to destroy the organization and protect those she loved, she had to consider it. "What's the catch?" she demanded. "What aren't you telling me?" The leader hesitated, his gaze shifting to Jason and Rebecca, then back to Emily. He took a deep breath as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. "The failsafe your father created," he began. "It's not just a simple shutdown. It's a reset. It will wipe out the organization, every trace of it, including the people who have been corrupted by it. But it will also wipe out everyone connected to it, including you." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. "So you want me to die for your mistakes?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. The leader's expression softened, and for the first time, he looked genuinely remorseful. "No, Emily. I want you to make the choice that your father couldn't. I want you to do what's right, even if it means sacrificing everything." Jason stepped forward, his face pale with determination. "There has to be another way. We can find it together. Don't listen to him, Emily. He's only telling you this because he has no other options." Rebecca reached out to touch Emily's shoulder. "Whatever you choose, Emily, we'll stand by you. But know that your father wouldn't have wanted you to pay the price for his sins." Emily's mind raced as she processed their words. The leader was asking her to sacrifice herself to destroy the organization, but Jason and Rebecca were offering her a way out, a chance to fight another day. But deep down, Emily knew that there were no guarantees. The organization would never stop hunting her, and the threat would never truly be gone unless she took this final step. The leader watched her intently, sensing her hesitation. "This is your chance, Emily. You can be the one to break the cycle, to end the pain. Don't let it all be for nothing." Emily closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She thought of everything she had lost, everything she had fought for. Her father, her childhood, her dreams of a normal life. This was her last chance to make it all mean something. When she opened her eyes, her decision was made. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do it, but on my terms." The leader's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "What are your terms?" Emily took a deep breath. "You deactivate the organization's defenses. Give me full control. I'll trigger the failsafe, but only after you and your agents stand down and leave the people I care about alone. No more threats, no more lies. You disappear, and this ends tonight." For a moment, the leader seemed to weigh his options. Then finally, he gave a short nod. "Agreed. I'll do what you ask. But remember, once the failsafe is activated, there's no going back." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Jason and Rebecca, who looked at her with a mixture of fear and pride. "Go," she whispered. "Get as far away from here as you can." Jason's eyes filled with anguish. "Emily, don't do this. We can still find another way." But Emily shook her head. "This is the only way to make sure they never come after us again. I need you to trust me." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes, but she managed a nod. "We're proud of you, Emily. You're stronger than you know." Emily watched as Jason and Rebecca reluctantly backed away, heading toward the tree line. She turned back to the leader, who was already inputting commands on a small device. The air crackled with tension as the defenses around the organization began to drop, one by one. When the final barrier was deactivated, the leader looked at Emily, his expression grim. "It's done. You have control now." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She stepped forward, reaching out to the device that would trigger the failsafe. Her hand trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was it, the end of the road. But just as she was about to press the button, the leader suddenly lunged at her, grabbing her wrist. His eyes were wild with desperation. "I can't let you do this," he shouted. "If you trigger it, we all die. There's another way, there has to be." Emily's heart raced as she struggled against him. She had seen the fear in his eyes before, but this was different. He was truly terrified. But it didn't matter. She had made her choice. With a final burst of strength, Emily broke free from his grip and slammed her hand down on the device. The world seemed to freeze for a moment, then everything exploded in a blinding flash of light. Emily felt a searing pain shoot through her body, but instead of fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The chaos, the lies, the pain, it was all fading away. The failsafe was doing its job, wiping out every trace of the organization, erasing the darkness that had consumed so many lives. In her final moments, Emily thought of Jason, Rebecca, and the life she had always wanted. She knew they would be safe now, free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. And as the light consumed her, Emily smiled, knowing that she had finally found peace. The organization was gone. The game was over. And Emily had won.